Hey guys, so we're into week 3, media power and ideology. So these 2 videos I'm going to make for you for this week are actually really short. I'm going to be covering some of the key fundamental aspects of political economy or Marxist political theory as a constituent part of the key theory within media studies as a subject. So what these sessions will do in a very brief way is just go over some of the key fundamental aspects of things you need to know about issues like media ownership and how ownership affects how the media portrays particular issues in society. And really, political economy and the political economy approach is a fundamental part of what we do in media studies. It's a cornerstone, really, in terms of theory of how to understand the operations of the media. Despite, political Marxism, being almost a filthy set of words in contemporary Western society, the notions of economics and how politics, economics and ownership intertwine with one another in terms of the ownership of the media remains an absolutely critical construct for us to understand in media theory. So buckle yourself in, this is going to be a quick run through. So we're really looking at, and what we're really concerned with, is the theoretical work of Karl Marx. And there is a representation of Karl Marx. So really what I want to look at here and in the next video are these things: Marx and Marxism, the concept of surplus labour and the media, Marx's view of ideology, which I'll cover in video 2, and how to do an ideological critique, which we'll largely do in the seminar. Actually, for this, what we'll do, we'll look at some media texts, and then we'll look at how to do a ideological critique of these things. So the key terms really are power and ideology. And there we have them. Marx and Engels. Marx, the ideas man; Engels, the wordsmith. Although Engels had some very important ideas too, and Engels' work was very much influenced by his time in England in the sort of middle part of the 19th century. Both of these are German gentlemen, but both really discovered political economy in England. And for those of you from North London, you might know that Karl Marx is buried in Highgate Cemetery. Okay, the original theory, and this is, I think, a good place to start, because as I alluded to, Marxism is problematic. Okay, Marxism has an image problem, basically, and we use Marxism in very derogatory terms very often, and it's kind of undeserved, albeit I do understand that, the way that Marxism as a political theory was used in the 20th century, in particular in communist countries, kind of gave it a bad name, and that bad name was kind of deserved in some ways as well. But for our intent, for our purposes here, Marxism, we're going to use it in a slightly different way in media theory. Okay, now the original aim of Marxism is to bring about a classless society based on the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. What does that mean, and why is it important to us? Well, a socialist or Marxist or communist society would have everyone owning the means of production in society. That means that anything that is produced in a society, spoons, tables, you might be able to work out here that I'm actually just looking around my room at the moment for objects, vacuum cleaners, dartboards, mobile phones. Those things in a typical capitalist society are produced by companies which are owned by individuals or groups of individuals. Those people become wealthy on the basis of selling those products to other people. They become a capitalist class in society. Now, the aim of Marxism, excuse me, I'm not going to edit that out. I'm a normal person, I'm allowed to sneeze. Is another one coming? Oh my God. No, I'm okay. So, in a capitalist society, those things are owned by capitalists, or in the Marxist system, what was called the bourgeoisie. Those who indeed purchase those items and indeed work for those capitalists are called the proletariat, the working class. The working class sells its labour to the capitalist to produce goods and services which are then sold for a profit. So the fundamental basis of Marxism was to try and make what you could call a more equitable society, where actually all the means of production were not held in the hands of a few rich people, but instead held in the hands of everyone. And therefore, in theory, everyone benefits from production and we have an equitable society. In practice, it probably should be argued that this hasn't worked, but in theory, that's what Marxism is. So really what we're interested in terms of media theory and media studies is this notion of the means of production, and we apply it to how media is produced. And then you start to think then, okay, well, what do you mean by this? Who are these capitalists or bourgeoisie that own media? Well, we know that media ownership is centralized in very few hands. You know, there are major companies which dominate the media landscape. I think of such wonderful companies as Disney. So evil. The Fox organization, you know, Rupert Murdoch's company, News International. These huge conglomerates dominate not just production but also distribution of media. And therefore, because of that, they centralize profits to their companies. So we as a consumer, and I'm going to push this a little bit further shortly because we're not just consumers in this, we are also workers in this system because we sell these companies labour, but I'll come to that in a second. What we do is we buy these products from these companies. The means of production of media are centralised in particular ways. Now, in social media, which is my area of research, this is even more concentrated. Facebook is everywhere. It's a horrendous company. It is, you know, I joke about, well, I don't really joke because Disney's kind of an awful company as well, but Disney is literally, you know, benevolent beyond belief compared to Facebook, which is a horrendous company with awful ethics and such an exploitative business model, it's untrue. And if you like, Facebook owns the means of production for social media. They own the platforms that we use. We just get arguments with people. Somebody will always say, you know, I don't use Facebook. And say, okay, what about Instagram? Yeah, I use Instagram. What about WhatsApp? Yeah, I use WhatsApp. Well, you use Facebook then. You know, because Facebook owns these companies. They own the means of production of communication in contemporary society. So when we're talking about the means of production in media, we're talking about those companies which own the way of producing media. And that can be spread across so many different areas. As we know, there are so many different mediums. We could be talking about radio, we could be talking about television, we could be talking about social media, we could be talking about internet access. There are companies which own these things, these means of production. Now, as I said, the aim of Marxism is bringing about a class of society based on common ownership of the means of production, distribution and exchange in a society. And what we have in terms of media is nothing like that. Okay, not even in a model like the BBC, for example. We can't claim that that's common ownership. Actually, it's a very different ownership model of the BBC. We don't own the BBC, we pay for it, so we are customers of it, but we don't own it just by dint of having a license, TV license in the UK. In terms of media generally, we are very interested always in who owns something, because that ownership therefore will tell us a lot about how things are produced, with what kind of politics and what kind of social positioning things are produced. Now, you might think, okay, this is a bit of a weird slide. What is going on here? Okay, prior to Marx's time and industrialization and the Industrial Revolution in the United Kingdom, industry was largely around these sort of images. You know, what we had was a system of cottage industries. So in the 1700s, as this is pictured here, you would have people working at home producing goods to be sold for a particular price, and it would be largely based around the home. Whole families would engage in particular industries like this. This here is weaving, for example. Now, through industrialization, the scale of production becomes absolutely vast. So by using machinery, people can produce more efficiently for less money after the fixed costs of the machinery and labor are taken into account. And all of a sudden you have a huge amount of surplus value in production. But the giant shift that we should be interested in here is who owns the production. You see, I'm just going to skip back for a second. Oh, I can't, of course, because I'm recording. In the cottage industry, what you have is people who own, effectively, their own business. Okay? And they have a direct relationship, therefore, to the products they're producing. Labour and product are closely aligned with one another. Now, in the factory setting, as we see here, labour becomes alienated from the product itself. You are producing for someone else, and you are producing loads of it. There's no craft involved. This is the root of what we call surplus value. So let's say I'm running a company, right, in my little cottage, you know, and I'm producing 10 t-shirts. And that basically, but if I sell those 10 t-shirts, I've covered myself for the day. Okay, great, fantastic. That's how cottage industries worked. Nobody really got rich because it's really hard to scale up to get rich. Anything above and beyond 10 t-shirts is surplus value, and that's where you get profit from. Once you've paid for all the outgoings that you might have, that's when you realize a profit for something. And what industrialization does is ramp up the possibility of surplus value. So the person who is making 10 garments in their cottage, they go to work into a factory, all of a sudden they're making 100 a day. And there's a huge amount of surplus value in that, and a huge amount of profit being made. Because the profit's not being made for that person. That person's just getting a fixed amount for their labor. All the profit goes to the person who owns the factory. And that is why Marxism argued for a classless society where everyone owned the means of production, because some people are getting rich off other people's labor. Of course, in order for as much surplus value as possible to be generated, you drive down wages and you drive down working conditions and you skimp and you cut corners and etc, 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 and you make people's lives as miserable as possible, and then you make more profit. That's why capitalism kills, kids. So surplus labor basically produces surplus value. Once you've got people working for free, then you start to get money. And you might think, okay, this doesn't really make any sense to me in terms of what we're talking about, ownership and so on. Now, Facebook doesn't charge us anything for using its products, but we're on them all the time. Effectively, by being on them all the time, we're creating data which Facebook sells to other organizations, advertisers, and that's how it creates money as a company. So we're not just giving them surplus labor, we're giving them free labor, because they're selling effectively what we do online. So actually, social media has perfected the model outlined here. So in terms of media, one of the key people I'd like you to become familiar with is Dallas Smythe, who came up with the idea of the audience commodity. As an audience of media, we are doing work. Our watching, reading and listening is a form of labor that is sold to advertisers for profit. So therefore, we create the surplus value for media organizations by being customers of them, by being an audience. Which is kind of, whoa. Yeah, and you know, it's a radical way of thinking about things, but yeah, every time you pick up your phone and go on Instagram, you're creating value. You know, you're creating information which is being sold on by Facebook for money. It's for very small amounts, but you got enough people doing it enough of the time, and that's how they generate money. So we're interested, therefore, in the ownership model of companies in terms of what it tells us about what our role is as an audience of media products, and quite importantly, what that ownership does in terms of shaping our experience of the world through media. Remember when I was talking in the earlier lectures of this module about how media shapes our reality? The ownership of media is very, very important in shaping of reality. Now, many of you will be familiar with either with this diagram or diagrams very similar to it. Marx proposed that society itself was structured in this kind of model. Now, this is what we call the base superstructure model. And the base consists of the economic structure of society, the material means of production, distribution, and exchange. And the superstructure consists of everything that is not to do with production in society. Basically, art, family, culture, religion, philosophy, law, media, politics, science, education, and ideology. Marx's argument here is that those people who own the means of production in society structure our relations in society, and this is called, although structuralism as a position only becomes known in the 1960s, this is really a structuralist model, because what it's arguing is that there is a structure within which shapes all of what goes on in society. And the Marxist model here is really, really straightforward. We have means of productions, there are companies that make things and they are owned by particular people. There's private property, there's capital, commodities, etc. And those means and relations of production shape and maintain culture, effectively. The superstructure, culture. So who owns the means of production for the media shapes what the media does and what the content of media is. So if you have a country like Britain, where most of the media is owned by a very small group of people who politically are aligned to a sort of neoliberalist view of economics and capitalism, and to a very sort of politically right-wing agenda, the media will reflect their politics and their ideas. So we have in Britain, largely, if you look at the newspapers in Britain, most newspapers are largely very, very right-wing in their viewpoint. Indeed, even the ones which are considered left-wing aren't really, Guardian, the Mirror and so on, they're not really left-wing, and certainly not as left-wing as they used to be when I was a kid. So the ownership of those companies shapes their content, and that content, that media content, then shapes society. Or plays a very significant role in the shaping of society. So we see, if you look at the base, who owns things at the bottom shapes culture itself. And then that culture itself maintains and shapes who owns things. And you might say, well, how does it do that? And you say, well, you have particular political ideas about who should own media companies. You have, particular media forms, and these ideas go back into legitimizing who owns things in society. So the legitimization through ideologies in the superstructure shape the base. This all sounds really nebulous, all right, but I'll go back to this sort of newspaper example. We have in the UK, most of the newspapers are owned by a very small number of politically right-wing people. They push out media which is politically right-wing. Those ideologies therefore become accepted in society, which means that in society you have legitimization of the ownership of the media by right-wing political individuals, because society is shaping it in that way. It's a whole thing. You can see how ownership therefore becomes extremely important in the political relations of a country. So the base and the superstructure basically consist of everything that is not to do with production in society. But of course, who owns things shapes education, family, religion, politics, culture, mass media. This is how the Marxist view of society works, and the material architecture of society. And this is really why it's incredibly important for us to understand as media students. Who owns the media shapes what the media does, and the media is so important in society that it plays a role in legitimizing the very ownership of the media itself. Okay, that's all I want to talk about in this video. I've come in under 20 minutes! Yes! Part 2, I'll talk more about ideology. See ya!